Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Rev Dr Sandy Yule. He's a retired Uniting Church minister, and we spoke last week generally about Sandy's background, and some very interesting points were raised. But he also raised the fact that he's written a couple of books, and today we'll go through one of those books, and it's a very topical book because it's relevant today as it was when it was written, and that's Making Peace and Making Sense. Sandy, welcome back.
Thank you.
And I'll leave it to you. You know the background of how this book happened.
Happy to be here. And this book was actually a book that World Student Christian Federation Asia Pacific Office and the Secretary asked me to write in 1984. And they were producing a series of books on a series of topics, and he asked me to write a book about peace. So it took about 4 years before it was published, but finally that got done. And it was very much in response to the fear of nuclear war during the Reagan presidency.
Yes.
The big times of fear of nuclear war have been the 40s and 50s, and I would say the 1980s.
Yeah.
Because the détente that existed in the 60s and 70s between Russia and America broke down a bit under a right-turning government under Ronald Reagan. However, not to make judgments about that necessarily, but the sense of fear and the need to address what that fear does to us became the catalyst for the book. I went to a study group looking at peace education, where we had a whole series of one meeting. The first meeting we looked at what were we going to put in a peace education agenda. And what we put in the peace education agenda was why war is so bad.
Ah, yes.
And then we realised what we were doing was scaring people witless.
Yes,
and that we had to actually start somewhere else. We had to start with why peace was in fact what life was about. And that war was then a disturbance of life, not itself the focus.
Ah, very interesting.
So actually lifting the profile of peace itself was required. So this book is a journey out of that sense of fear and entrapment by the inevitability of destruction. So you'll find the very first chapters on the nuclear nightmare, and the journey is really recognising what are the responses to the nuclear nightmare, what are the possible responses, fear and flight and despair. So if that's all we've got, is there not anything else?
Right.
And so hope comes in as a fourth possible response. So flight simply means denial, that you're not going to look at it at all and just hunker down. Fear is there as part of that, and despair is really consciously knowing that you can't do anything about it.
Yes.
And so therefore it just saps the energy out of everything.
Absolutely.
So then the question is, well, how do we generate a basis for hope? And the only way to do that is to develop a positive appreciation of peace and life.
Yes, and from a Christian perspective, of course, is Jesus' salute of saying peace be with you.
Indeed.
So that where did you draw? Did you draw from that as well as other relationships with peace in defining peace?
In the book I had images of peace as the next chapter, and the images of peace are really different ideas of peace that we find culturally.
Yes.
You know, so there's peace as the calm at the centre of the storm. So a lot of chaos going on, but there's peace at the heart, and this is the image of the whirlwind, basically.
Yes.
The hurricane. There's the king's peace, which is the order imposed from the political order, which may be just or it may be unjust.
Yes.
And then the various other kinds of peace. Peace as the absence of war is also there. The rest in peace is the peace of death. Which is a form of peace. So what do we make of that? And then eventually you get to God's peace,
Yes.
which is somehow from outside us as a gift. And how do you receive it? How do you even recognise it? And the way to recognise it that I was exploring in that book is to face the fear and to go into it rather than away from it, to find out what is there, to know, to understand where it's coming from, and to accept our vulnerability to death and to other forces, but not as the only force that matters. Yeah.
With peace, there's natural peace too, isn't there? So that in the natural environment, there is peace.
It's in there under harmony with nature, permaculture.
Okay.
So permaculture as the interaction of all the natural forces in a harmonious way was one of the images. There are 3 or 4 others that I go into in more detail.
Right.
Yeah.
We might go into those in more detail.
Yes, sure.
So,
Anyway, that's how I got into the topic of peace. Not from any what you might call ideological statement about God's peace as the answer. It's simply one of the images of peace which offer something.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to go, because it's an amalgamation of concepts. It's not sort of because you'll get opposition to some particular concepts, but there's always somewhere for you to hang your hat in.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Very, very, very important. And what is it I want?
The real sort of journey of the book was to try to use this process of going into the fear itself, the actual situation that you're in, looking for a way of harmonising it, redeeming it, making it peaceful.
Yeah, without being too political about it, we've got the situation now of a Prime Minister wanting to shirt front Putin, and then the interface and the eye holding and stuff that's gone on like very recently. Does that, you talked about the détente and then the breach of that in the Cold War. Does that ring any bells for you, this sort of potential Putin leaving early, for example?
Well, I think the importance of symbolic gesture as signalling intent is powerful. And so the intent to confront rather than the intent to engage leads us into more confrontation rather than more engagement.
Yes.
Engagement is simply being open to the other so that you hear the agenda of the other better, and then you find if there's anything you can do to meet that agenda in some sort of peacemaking negotiation and conflict resolution.
Yeah,
so if conflict resolution is your frame, then engagement. But confrontation suggests winner and loser.
Yeah, and we'll be a loser if we don't go to a break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony in Diversity, and we're speaking with Sandy Yule. He's a retired Uniting Church minister, and we've been discussing a book that he's written on making peace and making sense, but not so much to discuss the book, but to bring that into relevant to today. You've got a segment in here, Sandy, which we were talking about before, called Images of Peace. And there's 10 points listed there. One of them is order. How does that manifest itself as an image of peace?
Well, some people think that peace simply is order. So as long as a society is ordered and everybody's following the rules, we have peace. But if the order is oppressive or unjust in any way to members of the society, clearly the order is no longer unambiguously peace. So the issue of justice and whether there is oppression or whether there is, a disempowerment of people, and particularly how do you resolve different agendas? If there's conflict between members of society, can the order of society expand to cope with that? And if it can't, then is it really peaceful?
Okay, and order is often used by politicians around election time. So law and order has got some interesting connotations.
Law and order is appealing to people to rely on authority to provide peace, and that peace is more often than not the imposition of order on everybody. It's the rich and the poor alike are forbidden from sleeping under bridges.
Yes.
in the order in which we inhabit.
Yes.
So the justice of the order is very important. And that goes into all sorts of areas, financial and other power relationships.
Well, you've got the recent development in the United States of it being an offence to feed the poor at certain levels, which I'm not talking about that because that's someone else's problem. But yes, it's that some people suffer under order.
Under certain kinds of order,
yes.
And every order was likely to have some blind spots and some injustices built in, if it's humanly created.
This opens the requirement for governments to be well informed about this.
Yes.
Some of what you've been involved in has been one of those information sources, would you say? You're doing the research and passing it to the government through a roundabout route.
Oh, well, I think the church is doing that. I wouldn't put myself too much into
that.
But certainly the churches are doing that, and that's a very important function. And the welfare arms of the church are very well placed to know the real story about the poorer people in our community. And so their voice needs to be heard well, not just churches, but welfare organisations generally.
Yes, well, yes, that's right. And that raises the issue of sort of, and we had alluded to it before, the public relations component for church activities. On a proportional basis, what would you say the balance looked like between the secular and the religious component?
Well, if you add in all the voluntary support and components, the church is very, very strong.
Yes.
Anyway, going on to the other images of peace, which I think are also important, non-violence is important.
Absolutely.
And particularly where non-violence is used against a higher power that has the monopoly of violence. So non-violent protests are powerful because of the message that they highlight.
Yes.
And it's the influence that you want from a non-violent action, not the imposition of anything. You don't impose things through non-violence, but you can influence. And you can certainly highlight issues and support victims.
Yes.
And that leads into the issue of sacrifice, that the whole matter of making sacrifice is part of peacemaking.
Right.
Peace is made because people put themselves on the line to see that it happens.
Okay.
And that's partly soldiers. So that's the more obvious side of sacrifice. But I think there's also sacrifice on the side of people who speak up for victims and perhaps themselves become victimised.
Yes, and that's the end, because basically at the soldier end, unless they're volunteers, they're actually doing the job they're being paid for, so that's hardly the point. But so if you come back and you say, right, well, these silent social volunteers, they are a driver in this.
Can be.
Yes.
Can be, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's more the actual recognition that sacrifice is meaningful in the modern world.
Yes.
It's an old word which used to mean certain things, but in the modern world I think it needs to be rehabilitated.
Yes.
It's a making sacred of certain functions, and the function of being a voice for the voiceless.
Yes.
So standing up for victims, standing against evil, standing against bullies, etc. That involves sacrifice.
So some of the issues that might fall into that category, we've already addressed one of them. That's the refugee element of it. Is there any other which sort of leaps forward in that?
I think any situation where there are victims and vulnerable people, and other people are standing around and may or may not get involved, this issue is present, whether recognised or not.
Yes. Well, violence against women is pretty current at the moment, and as you say, there's a myriad of others.
It's a fairly universal matter, and that's why I think it's important to see it as an image of peacemaking. The willingness to sacrifice for the greater good of the society, and particularly for those victimised within society or some other process.
There's whole issues of loneliness, of age, disability. As you talk, it expands, and
yes, it does.
That really does relate to order, doesn't it?
Yes,
because
it does.
If those are falling down.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the order needs to include these elements within it: the conflict resolution, the non-violence, the hearing of voices, the communication, and the sacrifice. If that's all given space within the order, then it becomes a living, breathing order, which is peaceful, or potentially peaceful, if the peacemaking works,
Yes.
which it will be much more likely to do than if imposition is the order of the day.
Order of the day. Yes, this is there apart from the organisation you've been involved in, what other organisations feature in bringing this together?
Well, one of them that comes to mind would be Amnesty International as an example. You know, they're just about the voice, you know, raising a voice internationally for prisoners of conscience. It's a great example.
Yeah, and my conscience wouldn't let me rest if I don't say we have to go to a break.
Bad luck.
We'll be back in a moment.
Mani Allah, Alleluia, Mani Allah.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Sandy Yule. He's a retired Uniting Church minister. We're talking about all sorts of things, but at the moment we're talking about making peace, making sense, which is a book Sandy wrote quite some time ago. But what we're doing is bringing that forward into a current context. In here, under Studying Peace, you've got a topic which looks pretty fascinating, which is teaching about horror.
Yeah. It's really teaching about fear, because horror overwhelms us. Once we really experience horror, then you get frozen, you can't think, you know, your responses are automatic and often bad. So it's to do with the freezing and the fear, and how can there be intentional work to become, as it were, more focused and stronger in the face of things that are horrible. And we're flooded with them from television news nowadays.
Absolutely.
And some of them are natural disasters, but many of them are humanly made disasters. And the sense of enemies who are out to get us, and the fear that starts to inculcate even in us in comfortable Australia. So is there a way that we can, as it were, build up our resistance to that fear? Because the fear will lead us astray and make us respond, I think, negatively.
Yes.
What's needed is actually some method of bringing that reality into images that are truthful, where we are able to see a little more clearly as to what is really going on. What is the agenda of the other? What is valuable in that? What isn't valuable in that? And what are our resources? What can we do about it? Where are our allies? What is it doing to the whole world? Those are the sorts of questions that help us to actually formulate a response. And once we can formulate a response and start to test it out in even small ways, our ability to respond grows, our sense of empowerment grows, and our sense of peace is likely to re-emerge.
Is that response, is that formulated in any way that you could talk about some of the issues?
I think it depends on the issue. I mean, I can remember a time when I was very afraid of the possibility of being, so to speak, set up by some enemy organisation. I won't go into detail, but
that's right.
The fear was there. I could really sense that. So for me, the pathway through that was to recognise that I was being got at and I was being afraid, that it wasn't necessarily manipulative, just part of the way things were, and that I was vulnerable.
Yes.
That there wasn't anything I could do to forestall an attack if somebody did take it into their heads to put a bomb in my car or, you know, do something else like that. But it wasn't all that likely.
No.
And over time, it settled down as an attitude where acknowledging it was there was enough. And then the fear itself was no longer overwhelming.
Yes.
So it was actually a way of going into the fear and through it in that particular sense of fear and threat. Right. But every situation is likely to be different.
Yes.
So it's more a general recommendation, I think, that intentional work, creating an analysis and I think even through images, and this includes a lot of reading where you read science fiction and fantasy novels where dystopian societies are portrayed very interestingly, and how people actually found a way past that.
Yes.
Those are the kinds of resources that help, I think.
Yeah, I'm minded of the fact that there's also fear itself is a fairly constant factor, but the level of fear, like the level of fear of changing jobs, the level of fear of death or moving suburbs. Would it be, or do you deal with the fact of dealing with those lower level fears and looking at the common grounds between those and the higher level fears?
Yes. Yeah, it certainly helps. I think it's the same sort of dynamic in each case.
Yes,
actually.
Yes, that's it's a major issue. You mentioned media, and that's highly irresponsible. Some of the stuff that they do. Is there anything being done about that? And when I say being done, I don't mean confrontations here. I'm talking about sort of studious research to try and manage that.
I think there is, but I'm not very much aware of that or part of it. But I just think it's a very difficult issue for the media. You know, I mean, if something is put up as an image which sends a message, then media generally say, well, there's a message there. The public has a right to know, and that's not bad in general terms. But sometimes the message is so fear-inducing that then people start to say, well, wait a minute, do we really want to be carrying this message? And I just think it's a hard choice. I don't see an easy answer for the media. It's simply that there are plenty of people who have learned to use the media for these kinds of political and terrorist purposes. And they want to terrorise, and they do. Now, how do we as a society cope with that, and how do we deal with that? That's a current issue. That's exactly in this ballpark.
Yes, it is, and that's why this is relevant today as it was when you wrote it. I'm minded of risk management, the risk management process of likelihood and consequences, and that's an amazingly unfamiliar process for a lot of people. But even learning at that level of likelihood and consequences helps as well.
It does help. It does help.
It's worry about meteors. The likelihood of being struck by a meteor or is pretty remote, but the consequences are dramatic.
Horrific.
Yes, like vaporization and all sorts of stuff.
Yes.
So another point, just following from that, in working with images, imagining a world without weapons, how does that fit together?
Well, I think it's one of the more interesting consequences of sociological theory, which says, well, society in a way is held in place by the ideas we have in our heads. And these are collectively gathered so that we have the same ideas, therefore we can interact as a society. And language helps us to hold all that together. But if society has certain dysfunctional elements or unjust elements, how are they addressed? And one way of addressing them is to say, can we actually imagine another set of relationships, another language, another way of interacting? And how far can we go with that? And it is actually interesting to be in a group which takes 2 or 3 days to try to develop a collective scenario which is better.
Now, John Lennon approached that in his famous song, Imagine.
Indeed.
Now, we're going to imagine if we had time forever, which we don't. We need to finish, but I'd really like to talk to you again next week. Would you be available?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks very much, Sandy.
Sure.
Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and we'll speak again to Sandy Yule. We'll see you then.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu